Hello， 大家好，我是利恩。今天又要来做我们最喜欢的桑德尔教授的正义课第二课啦。这还没有看过上一期第一课的同学，这一次第二课因为是延续到上一堂课的内容，所以我强烈建议，好不好？先去把第一课看完。为什么呢？因为在第一课我们学到了道德律的两种理论架构，一种就是相对主义，或说功利主义，也就是从结果再来决定是否我们的行为合乎道德。好，那另外一种呢，就是康德所提出的绝对道德律。那绝对道德呢，他认为说道德它应该是有一个不变的标准，那只是在于我们人是否能够去思索，或者是说去明白这个世界上是有一个绝对道德的价值。好，那这一次第二堂课呢，桑德尔教授就要带我们继续来讨论的是，特别是针对在结果道德主义，也就是功利主义道德的大师 Jeremy Bentham 他提出的这个结果道德，也就是依照多数人的利益、整体的幸福为标准来定义什么事情可以做，什么事情不能做。好，所以你必须还是要先回过去看，你才能够知道这两者的分别。而且我也希望观众呢，能够先对于绝对道德跟结果道德呢，你在心里面最好有一个自己的一个偏向或定见，因为这样会比较好去帮助你再去思想这一次第二课所面临到的这个真实案件的时候呢，就可以跟课堂上的同学一起来进行思考，去思想怎么样才是你觉得更好的选择哦。好，废话不多说，就让我们开始好不容易期待的第二堂吧 ，Let's go！
We started out last time with some stories, with some moral dilemmas about trolley cars and about doctors and healthy patients vulnerable to being victims of organ transplantation. We noticed two things about the arguments we had. One had to do with the way we were arguing. We began with our judgments in particular cases. We tried to articulate the reasons or the principles lying behind our judgments. And then, confronted with a new case, we found ourselves re-examining those principles, revising each in the light of the other. And we noticed the built-in pressure to try to bring into alignment our judgments about particular cases and the principles we would endorse on reflection. We also noticed something about the substance of the arguments that emerged from the discussion. We noticed that sometimes we were tempted to locate the morality of an act in the consequences, in the results, in the state of the world that it brought about. And we called this consequentialist moral reasoning. But we also noticed that in some cases, we weren't swayed only by the result. Sometimes, many of us felt that not just consequences, but also the intrinsic quality or character of the act matters morally. Some people argued that there are certain things that are just categorically wrong, even if they bring about a good result, even if they save 5 people at the cost of 1 life. So we contrasted consequentialist moral principles with categorical ones. Today, and in the next few days, we will begin to examine one of the most influential versions of consequentialist moral theory. And that's the philosophy of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century English political philosopher, gave the first clear systematic expression to the utilitarian moral theory. And Bentham's idea, his essential idea, is a very simple one, with a lot of morally intuitive appeal. Bentham's idea is the following: the right thing to do, the just thing to do, is to maximize utility. What did he mean by utility? He meant by utility the balance of pleasure over pain, happiness over suffering. Here's how he arrived at the principle of maximizing utility. He started out by observing that all of us, all human beings, are governed by two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. We human beings like pleasure and dislike pain. And so we should base morality, whether we're thinking about what to do in our own lives, or whether as legislators or citizens we're thinking about what the laws should be. The right thing to do individually or collectively is to maximize, act in a way that maximizes the overall level of happiness. Bentham's utilitarianism is sometimes summed up with the slogan, "the greatest good for the greatest number." With this basic principle of utility on hand, let's begin to test it and to examine it by turning to another case, another story, but this time not a hypothetical story, a real-life story, the case of the Queen versus Dudley and Stevens. This was a 19th century British law case that's famous and much debated in law schools. Here's what happened in the case. I'll summarize the story, then I want to hear how you would rule, imagining that you are the jury. A newspaper account of the time described the background. A sadder story of disaster at sea was never told than that of the survivors of the yacht Mignonette. The ship foundered in the South Atlantic, 1,300 miles from the Cape. There were 4 in the crew. Dudley was the captain. Stevens was the first mate. Brooks was a sailor. All men of excellent character, or so the newspaper account tells us. The 4th crew member was the cabin boy, Richard Parker, 17 years old. He was an orphan. He had no family. And he was on his first long voyage at sea. He went, the news account tells us, rather against the advice of his friends. He went in the hopefulness of youthful ambition, thinking the journey would make a man of him. Sadly, it was not to be. The facts of the case were not in dispute. A wave hit the ship, and the Mignonette went down. The 4 crew members escaped to a lifeboat. The only food they had were 2 cans of preserved turnips, no fresh water. For the first 3 days, they ate nothing. On the 4th day, they opened one of the cans of turnips and ate it. The next day, they caught a turtle. Together with the other can of turnips, the turtle enabled them to subsist for the next few days, and then for 8 days, they had nothing. No food, no water. Imagine yourself in a situation like that. What would you do? Here's what they did. By now, the cabin boy, Parker, is lying at the bottom of the lifeboat in the corner because he had drunk seawater against the advice of the others, and he had become ill, and he appeared to be dying. So on the 19th day, Dudley, the captain, suggested that they should all have a lottery, that they should draw lots to see who would die to save the rest. Brooks refused. He didn't like the lottery idea. We don't know whether this was because he didn't want to take the chance or because he believed in categorical moral principles. But in any case, no lots were drawn. The next day, There was still no ship in sight, so Dudley told Brooks to avert his gaze, and he motioned to Stevens that the boy Parker had better be killed. Dudley offered a prayer. He told the boy his time had come, and he killed him with a penknife, stabbing him in the jugular vein. Brooks emerged from his conscientious objection to share in the gruesome bounty. For 4 days, the three of them fed on the body and blood of the cabin boy. True story. And then they were rescued. Dudley describes their rescue in his diary with staggering euphemism, quote, "On the 24th day, as we were having our breakfast, a ship appeared at last. The three survivors were picked up by a German ship. They were taken back to Falmouth in England, where they were arrested and tried. Brooks turned state's witness. Dudley and Stevens went to trial. They didn't dispute the facts. They claimed they had acted out of necessity. That was their defense. They argued, in effect, better that one should die so that three could survive. The prosecutor wasn't swayed by that argument. He said murder is murder, and so the case went to trial. Now imagine you are the jury, and just to simplify the discussion, put aside the question of law, and let's assume that you as the jury are charged with deciding whether what they did was morally permissible or not. How many would vote not guilty, that what they did was morally permissible? And how many would vote guilty, what they did was morally wrong? A pretty sizable majority. Now let's see what people's reasons are, and let me begin with those who are in the minority. Let's hear first from the defense of Dudley and Stevens. Why would you morally exonerate them? What are your reasons? Yes?
I think it is morally reprehensible, but I think that there's a distinction between what's morally reprehensible and what makes someone legally accountable. In other words, as the judge said, what's always moral isn't necessarily against the law. And while I don't think that necessity justifies theft or murder or any illegal act, at some point your degree of necessity does in fact exonerate you from any guilt.
Okay, good. Other defenders, other voices for the defense, moral justifications for what they did. Yes?
All right, thank you. I just feel like in a situation that desperate, you have to do what you have to do to survive.
You have to do what you have to do.
You got to do what you got to do, pretty much. If you've been going 19 days without any food, someone just has to take the sacrifice. Someone has to make the sacrifice, and people can survive. Right. And furthermore, from that, let's say they survive, and then they become productive members of society who go home and start like 1 million charity organizations and this and that and this and that. I mean, they benefit everybody in the end.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what they did afterwards. They might have gone and kill more people, whatever. But
what? What if they went home and they turned out to be assassins?
What if they weren't going home and turned out to be assassins? Well,
you'd want to know who they assassinated.
That's true too. That's fair. That's fair.
Okay.
I want to know who they assassinated.
All right, that's good. What's your name?
Marcus.
Marcus. All right. We've heard a defense. A couple of voices for the defense. Now we need to hear from the prosecution. Most people think what they did was wrong. Why? Yes.
One of the first things that I was thinking was, if they haven't been eating for a really long time, maybe they're mentally affected, and so then that could be used as a defense, a possible argument that they weren't in the proper state of mind, they weren't making decisions they might otherwise be making, and if that's an appealing argument that you have to be in an altered mindset to do something like that, it suggests that people who find that argument convincing do think that they were acting immorally.
But I want to know what you think. You defend them. You vote to convict, right?
Yeah, I don't think that they acted in a morally appropriate way.
And why not? What do you say? Here's Marcus. He just defended them. He said, you heard what he said.
Yes. Yes.
That you've got to do what you've got to do in a case like that.
Yeah.
What do you say to Marcus?
That there's no situation that would allow human beings to take the idea of fate or that the other people's lives in their own hands, that we don't have that kind of power.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And what's your name?
Britt.
Britt?
Yes.
Okay. Who else? What do you say? Stand up.
I'm wondering if Dudley and Stevens had asked for Richard Parker's consent in, dying, if that would that exonerate them from an act of murder? And if so, is that still morally justifiable?
That's interesting. All right. Consent. Wait. Hang on. What's your name?
Kathleen.
Kathleen says, suppose they had asked, what would that scenario look like? So, in the story, Dudley is there, penknife in hand, but instead of the prayer, or before the prayer, he says, Parker, would you mind? We're desperately hungry, as Marcus empathizes with. We're desperately hungry. You're not going to last long anyhow.
Yeah. You can be a martyr.
Would you be a martyr?
Yeah.
How about it, Parker? Then what do you think? Would it be morally justified then? Suppose Parker, in his semi-stupor, says, okay.
I don't think it would be morally justifiable, but I'm wondering...
Even then it wouldn't be.
No.
You don't think that even with consent, it would be morally justified. Are there people who think, who want to take up Kathleen's consent idea and who think that that would make it morally justified? Raise your hand if it would, if you think it would. That's very interesting. Why would consent make a moral difference? Why would it? Yes.
Well, I just think that if he was making his own original idea and it was his idea to start with, then that would be the only situation in which I would see it being appropriate in any way. Because that way you couldn't make the argument that he was pressured, it's 3-1 or whatever the ratio was.
Right.
And I think that if he was making a decision to give his life, then he took on the agency to sacrifice himself, which some people might see as admirable, and other people might disagree with that decision.
So if he came up with the idea, that's the only kind of consent we could have confidence in morally, then it would be okay. Otherwise, it would be kind of coerced consent under the circumstances, you think. Is there anyone who thinks that even the consent of Parker would not justify their killing him? Who thinks that? Yes, tell us why. Stand up.
I think that Parker would be killed with the hope that the other crew members would be rescued. So there's no definite reason that he should be killed because you don't know when they're going to get rescued. So if you kill him, it's killing him in vain. Do you keep killing a crew member until you're rescued and then you're left with no one? Because someone's going to die eventually.
Well, the moral logic of the situation seems to be that they would keep on picking off the weakest, maybe, one by one, until they were rescued. And in this case, luckily, they were rescued when 3 at least were still alive. Now, if Parker did give his consent, would it be all right, do you think, or not?
No.
No.
It still wouldn't be right.
And tell us why it wouldn't be all right.
First of all, cannibalism, I believe, is morally incorrect. So you shouldn't be eating a human anyway.
So cannibalism is morally objectionable as such. So then, even on the scenario of waiting until someone died, still it would be objectionable.
Yes, to me personally. I feel like it all depends on one's personal morals And like, we can't sit here and just, like, this is just my opinion. Of course, other people are going to disagree. But
well, we'll see. Let's see what their disagreements are, and then we'll see if they have reasons that can persuade you or not. Let's try that. All right. Let's, now, is there someone who can explain, those of you who are tempted by consent, can you explain why consent makes such a moral difference? What about the lottery idea? Does that count as consent? Remember, at the beginning, Dudley proposed a lottery. Suppose that they had agreed to a lottery, then how many would then say it was all right? Suppose there were a lottery, cabin boy lost, and the rest of the story unfolded. Then how many people would say it was morally permissible? So the numbers are rising if we had a lottery. Let's hear from one of you for whom the lottery would make a moral difference. Why would it?
I think the essential element in my mind that makes it a crime is the idea that they decided at some point that their lives were more important than his, and that, I mean, that's kind of the basis for really any crime, right? It's like, my needs, my desires are more important than yours, and mine take precedent. And if they had done a lottery where everyone consented that someone should die, and it's sort of like they're all sacrificing themselves to save the rest.
Then it would be all right.
A little grotesque, but...
But morally permissible?
Yes.
And what's your name?
Matt.
So, Matt, for you, what bothers you is not the cannibalism, but the lack of due process.
I guess you could say that.
Right? And can someone who agrees with Matt say a little bit more about why a lottery would make it, in your view, morally permissible? Go ahead.
The way I understood it originally was that was the whole issue, is that the cabin boy was never consulted about whether or not something was going to happen to him, even with the original lottery, whether or not he would be a part of that. It was just decided that he was the one that was going to die.
Right, that's what happened in the actual case.
Right.
But if there were a lottery and they'd all agreed to the procedure, you think that would be okay?
Right, because then everyone knows that there's going to be a death. Whereas, the cabin boy didn't know that this discussion was even happening. There was no, forewarning for him to know that, hey, I may be the one that's dying.
All right, now suppose everyone agrees to the lottery, they have the lottery, the cabin boy loses, and he changes his mind.
You've already decided. It's like a verbal contract. You can't go back on that. You've decided, the decision was made. If you know that you're dying for the reason for others to live, you would, if someone else had died, that you would consume them. So that's
right. But then he could say, I know, but I lost.
I just think that that's the whole moral issue, is that there was no consulting of the cabin boy, and that that's what makes it the most horrible, is that he had no idea what was even going on. That had he known what was going on, it would be a bit more understandable.
All right, good. Now I want to hear, so there are some who think it's morally permissible, but only about 20%. Led by Marcus. Then there are some who say the real problem here is the lack of consent. Whether the lack of consent to a lottery, to a fair procedure, or, Kathleen's idea, lack of consent at the moment of death. And if we add consent, then more people are willing to consider the sacrifice morally justified. I want to hear now, finally, from those of you who think even with consent, even with a lottery, even with a final murmur of consent by Parker at the very last moment, it would still be wrong. And why would it be wrong? That's what I want to hear. Yes?
Well, the whole time I've been leaning all towards the categorical moral reasoning. And I think that there's a possibility I'd be okay with the idea of a lottery and then the loser taking into their own hands to kill themselves. so that there wouldn't be, an act of murder. But I still think that even that way, it's coerced. And also, I don't think that there's any remorse. Like in Dudley's diary, we were eating our breakfast. It seems as though he's just sort of like, the whole idea of not valuing someone else's life. So that makes me feel like I have to take the categorical.
You want to throw the
stand.
book at him when he lacks remorse or a sense of having done anything wrong.
Right.
So, all right, good. Any other defenders of who say it's just categorically wrong, with or without consent? Yes, stand up. Why?
I think undoubtedly the way our society is shaped, murder is murder. Murder is murder in every way, and our society looks at murder down on it in the same light, and I don't think it's any different in any case.
Good. Let me ask you a question. There were 3 lives at stake versus 1.
Okay.
The cabin boy, he had no family, he had no dependents. These other 3 had families back home in England, they had dependents, they had wives and children. Think back to Bentham. Bentham says we have to consider the welfare, the utility, the happiness of everybody. We have to add it all up. So it's not just numbers 3 against 1. It's also all of those people at home. In fact, the London newspaper at the time and popular opinion sympathized with them, Dudley and Stevens. And the paper said if they weren't motivated by affection and concern for their loved ones at home and their dependents, surely they wouldn't have done this.
Yeah, and how is that any different from people on the corner trying to have the same desire to feed their family? I don't think it's any different. I think in any case, if I'm murdering you to advance my status, that's murder, and I think that we should look at that all in the same light instead of criminalizing certain activities and making certain things seem more violent and savage, when in the same case it's all the same. It's all the same act and mentality that goes into murder, necessity to feed your family. So
suppose it weren't 3, suppose it were 30, 300. 1 life to save 300. Or in wartime, 3,000.
Okay.
Suppose the stakes are even bigger.
Suppose the stakes are even bigger. I think it's still the same deal.
Do you think Bentham is wrong to say the right thing to do is to add up the collective happiness? You think he's wrong about that?
I don't think he's wrong, but I think murder is murder in any case.
Yeah, well, then Bentham has to be wrong. If you're right, he's wrong.
Okay, then he's wrong.
All right.
Right.
Thank you. Well done. All right, let's step back from this discussion and notice how many objections have we heard to what they did. We heard some defenses of what they did. The defenses had to do with necessity, their dire circumstance, and, implicitly at least, the idea that numbers matter. And not only numbers matter, but the wider effects matter. Their families back home, their dependents. Parker was an orphan. No one would miss him. So if you add up, if you try to calculate the balance of happiness and suffering, you might have a case for saying what they did was the right thing. And then we heard at least 3 different types of objections. We heard an objection that said, what they did was categorically wrong, Mike here at the end, categorically wrong. Murder is murder, it's always wrong, even if it increases the overall happiness of society. A categorical objection. But we still need to investigate why murder is categorically wrong. Is it because even cabin boys have certain fundamental rights? And if that's the reason, where do those rights come from if not from some idea of the larger welfare or utility or happiness? Question number 1. Others said a lottery would make a difference, a fair procedure, Matt said. And some people were swayed by that. That's not a categorical objection exactly. It's saying everybody has to be counted as an equal, even though at the end of the day, one can be sacrificed for the general welfare. That leaves us with another question to investigate. Why does agreement to a certain procedure, even a fair procedure, justify whatever result flows from the operation of that procedure. Question number 2. And question number 3, the basic idea of consent. Kathleen got us onto this. If the cabin boy had agreed himself, and not under duress, as was added, then it would be all right to take his life to save the rest. And even more people signed on to that idea. But that raises a third philosophical question. What is the moral work that consent does? Why does an act of consent make such a moral difference that an act that would be wrong, taking a life without consent, is morally permissible with consent? To investigate those 3 questions, we're going to have to read some philosophers. And starting next time, we're going to read Bentham and John Stuart Mill, utilitarian philosophers.
好，那我觉得第2堂课也是一样，非常非常的精彩哈。为什么第2堂课在结果道德律这边探讨到之后，我们发现到一个有趣的问题，就是说大多数的人哈是没有办法单纯用结果主义来做道德的选择的，大家就会开始出现一种条件的情况。如果大家有看我之前做的一部就是谈这个 OnlyFans 女星24小时跟100名男性发生叉关系的那部影片呢，那你就会知道 Ben Shapiro 他里面提到的一个著名的社会心理学家 Jonathan Haidt 那 Jonathan Haidt 他就提到的6个道德的举证，那6个道德举证其中一个就是所谓的同意与胁迫，所以你会发现这个同意与胁迫决定的一个道德判断就刚好吻合了这一次桑德尔教授所提的这一个海难事件，对吧？很有趣似乎大部分人都同意，如果汤底的那一个快要垂死的那个小男孩，他如果本身是也同意了他是可以被杀以来成全别人的生存的话呢，那就有更多的人会倾向愿意支持这一个所谓谋杀的行为，它是可以允许或者说可以被接受的。所以大家有没有发现到，其实这个时候同意与否就已经是我们人在对于道德判断上面的一个很奇妙，可以说是你甚至你不曾认真思考，可是你心里就是会如此认为的一个准则。那这一点呢，我认为其实它仍然透露出一种就是康德所谓的绝对道德标准当中的其中一项。换句话说，社会心理学家Jonathan Haidt 他其实提出的6边形呢，你也可以看作是说某种程度上满足了这6个举证，恐怕它就是一种更高的所谓的绝对道德了那这也反过来讲就是说为什么有一个穿绿衣服的女同学呢，她就仍然认为说，哪怕经过了抽签，然后哪怕那个汤底男孩他也自愿参加，而且他也输了然后甚至他如果输了，他自己选择自杀，再给其他人分食，而不是等其他人来谋杀他，构成一个谋杀罪。他认为哪怕尽管是这样的，那么这个男孩输了，他某种程度上仍然是一种被迫的同意，也就是说你参与这个赌注，那你是不是真的心甘情愿？他又认为说未必这个自杀仍然是非自愿性的，因为只是纯粹是因为你输了，所以你必须被迫自杀嘛所以他认为这仍然没有到100%的同意，或者是说完全的心甘情愿。那他就认为说，这不见得是一个完全合乎道德的一个结果。我先不去论这个女同学，我个人认为她的看法是否正确，但是确实这个女同学她其实在思考的东西，其实就是 Jonathan Haidt 的道德的6个举证象限里头，他除了同意与胁迫这一点之外，他还再去思考有没有可能有其他的法则来判断。Ben Shapiro 里面提到的，包含就是有所谓的权威跟反叛，还有所谓的就是神圣与堕落等等。为什么我在上一集像我自己就说我是偏向绝对道德，是因为我自己都无法去说绝对道德的范畴到底在哪里。所以我认为最理想的方式是这样的。那但是有人就思考的，他认为仍然不够满意那有人就会认为说，我还想要再去想更多的东西。我认为这都是好事情。当你愿意去越想的时候，你就会发现到你会是越倾向于绝对道德主义的人但是绝对道德主义的人也会不会因此就变成了比较没有办法去表达出对别人的软弱所产生的怜悯或同情呢？我必须说，这个确实是太追求绝对道德的人的相对的一个可能会付出的代价 那没有错，大家看你的道德标准确实是最好是最高，可是是否会变成你会不允许一些人性软弱的空间？那换句话又说回来的，人性的软弱真的可以被允许吗？好，这就是道德有趣的地方。那我在这边呢，我就想跟大家聊一个，就是说，好比说我们讲堕胎，对吧？那堕胎这个议题上，就有人认为说，为什么要大费周章去讨论一大堆好？这个法律没有决定以外的事情，大家要晓得哈，其实法律的制定它是本于人性道德论而来的。如果人没有道德的问题的话，那就不需要有法律啦。你看动物自然界没有道德的对错的问题的时候，动物自然界里头不需要去制定所谓的法律。好，当然不是说因为他们智商还不够到制定法律，而是说对他而言，他们没有这样的一个所谓的怀疑或者是说一个矛盾。可是，在人身上是有的。那这也是我一直主张的，为什么人会有，就是因为我们是上帝造人，上帝造人。那当旧约这个伊甸园人吃了善恶树果子之后呢，人懂得分辨善恶，你也可以解读成就是人因此他无法完全照动物性的方式生活，合乎自然律，我们就随心所欲的弱肉强食，适者生存法则，无法的，人就是没有可能会这样子走。那不这样走，已经与生俱来在我们智慧人种当中，它就是深深刻印在我们的灵魂当中，或者说我们的大脑的结构思考当中，我们就是会去思考道德的问题。所以这也是为什么我一直说，没有思考这些问题，何来制定法律？法律虽然它不能去设上限，但是它绝对可以设下限，而下限就是什么是最基本合乎道德原则。你不能连基本的道德原则都不用，那这样的话，那谋杀就可以是合法了，胁迫他人就可以是合法，那一切行为都只是你的动物性，那就没有所谓的非法合法的问题了，对吧？好，那第二个就是我想引申的，就是大家其实也会发现哈，为什么保守主义者多半是比较偏向反堕胎的，其实也跟这一堂课息息相关，就是因为保守主义者认为这个胎儿一个生命，好，在未经他的同意情况之下被杀死这件事情是不道德的。好，那反对者可能就会挑战说，第一个，胎儿是生命嘛？好，那我们先假设，如果胎儿就是生命，我想同意与否，在我们这堂课当中就看得出来。所以这也是为什么，其实后来在反堕胎的保守主义团体跟支持堕胎者来讲，比较会辩论的一个症结点，就是说，到底什么时候算是生命，对吧？如果一旦到了生命的界限的时候，那么确实，尽管他还是胎儿，他不会说话，但是为什么在法律上仍然要保护他们？因为他们已经有了一个所谓的天赋人权。换句话说，也就是除非他们自愿或同意，否则的话，你就不能剥夺生命权。所以就是好像很多国家，比如说台湾，就是定义在如果满了6个月大的胎儿的时候呢，就视同为是有生命，6个月大之后是不可以堕胎的。好，但是呢，反堕胎的保守主义就会认为说，那生命的界限在哪里？你怎么能够一定界定6个月大就算是生命的开始？好，所以这个又是另外一个问题了。大家了解我的意思吗？但是除了生命的界限之外，为什么胎儿满一定的周数是不可以堕胎的？其实是跟同意好与胁迫与被迫这件事情息息相关。所以大家就会要去明白到，其实桑德尔教授这第2堂的正义课，从结果主义来看，其实他后面探讨的东西本质上面跟是否可以堕胎，或者说什么样的情况才可以堕胎，其实它是可以等同于来进行讨论的。好，这是我的补充。好。那补充呢，我并不想要给大家一个答案，认为什么是对或错，因为每个人的道德观它都是有它的尺度的，只是我希望给大家是更好的去思考我们的道德律是怎么产生的。那你所相信的价值有没有可能，也许当问题来的时候可以被挑战？当然了，你怎么知道你现在所相信的，一定你到时候会选择啊？那这个我同意，因为这个就是人性软弱的大挑战嘛。好，我们现在用想的，我们可以去认为我是倾向哪一边，可是真实碰到的话，确实坦白说，我也不敢说相信的价值你自己是否会真的实践。好，所以我讲这个我们不要太过苛求。我们今天不是在讨论的是你能不能实践你所相信的价值，我们只是单纯讨论的是你是怎么去相信你自己所产生的这一套看待世间的道德观。OK， 好吧？希望我这样充分的啰里啰嗦的补充呢，大家能够听得喜欢，也觉得有收获。那如果好不好，跟上一部一样，如果这一部按赞人数够多，支持人够多的话，请多多在下方留言告诉我你想看第3堂课，那我就会继续来做我们为期总共有12堂的桑德尔教授的正义课了。我们好了，我们先同意有下部第3堂影片，再见，拜拜。
曾经有一份真诚影片摆在我的面前，但是我没有珍惜，等到想看却找不到，才后悔莫及。尘世间最痛苦的事莫过于此。 如果上天可以给我一个机会再看一次，我会跟那个频道说订阅。如果非要把这订阅加上一个期限，我希望是10000年。
This we know, the cornerstone is Christ alone.